All right, so the last section we're going to talk about for this class is far-right terrorism. So this is like terrorists, like white nationalists, Proud Boys, a variety of different groups that we're going to talk about. A lot of anti-immigrant, white supremacists, kind of terrorists, and obviously, not everyone that this isn't like these groups don't represent the political right or don't represent Republican voters, but this is basically this is what happens when you take the same narratives that are being sold to conservative voters to win the narratives of the anti-immigrant, anti-black, anti-indigenous narratives, and then you have groups of people that take it to the next level, and take it to the point where they're actually going to act on that instead of just voting for the Republican Party who's going to control everything and keep us safe. They're actually going to go out and get some guns and actually act on these perceived threats. This is an extension of the political right, but this is the extreme extension. So I'm gonna read these two quotes. One's by Don Lemon from CNN. He says, "We have to stop demonizing people and realize the biggest terror threat in this country is white men. Most of them radicalized to the right, and we have to start doing something about them." And then John Cohen, who actually oversaw the Department of Homeland Security's counterterrorism portfolio, writes, "The most significant terror-related threat facing the U.S. today comes from violent extremists who are motivated by white supremacy and other right ideological causes," which both of these, quotes are based on facts and based on numbers and based on realities that we're experiencing, but at the same time are complete opposite of what the political right is selling. This idea that white terrorism doesn't really exist. It's more about Islamic terrorists or invasions of brown people or dangerous black people, fighting, protesters, Antifa, fighting, police brutality are actually the real terrorists. So it's important that we understand that the biggest threat of terrorism actually comes from the right, actually comes from white supremacists and far right terrorism in this country. So when we look at hate groups, so the Southern Poverty Law Center is a really amazing organization that monitors a lot of the hate groups in this country, hundreds of hate groups, and provides a lot of the data that we have comes from this organization. And they define hate groups as an organization that, based on its official statements and principles, the statements of its leaders or its activities, has beliefs or practices that attack or malign an entire class of people. So these are hate groups. They could be anti-immigrant, they could be anti-Semitic, it could be anti-women, they could be anti-black people. So this is hate groups. And then you have, and what we've seen, particularly since the turn of the century, is this explosion of hate groups right now. And this is, I think this data from last year, so I imagine it's even worse than this right now. But really, since the turn of the century, the first thing kind of launches this new wave of hate groups. And we've always had hate groups, throughout our history, but they come in waves, and we're currently right in the middle of a major wave. And right now, what really got them going is demographic changes. Particularly in the 90s, and early 2000s, we saw a lot of a huge increase in Latinx immigrants, and that caused a lot of white anger over demographic changes. And then, also demographic projections, like the 2008 census report that basically says that white people are going to be a minority in 2045. So that caused a lot of people to fear, or at least caused the political right to push these, fear, narratives that that they should be scared, when they become a minority, because all these, because literally, like, after the end of the Civil War, we've been selling these black criminality, myths and these stereotypes, these false stereotypes that black people are criminals, and we have to protect ourselves through violence, either through lynching or terrorism or police violence or state violence. And we've sold that narrative again with immigrants, Muslim immigrants and brown immigrants from the South, all these people that are threatening white people at this point, and they need and the only thing holding them back is the Republican Party, and they're going to be a minority minority, here soon. So that's caused a lot of people a lot of white supremacist groups to kind of start organizing. And then, especially around, a lot of racial dog whistles that we've been seeing in the 21st century has really sponsored a lot of them, particularly with 2016 Trump's election. We saw a huge explosion occurring. So, so we do see, if we're looking at the scale, this is the scale of hate groups, last, 2 decades. And we see a big explosion after 9/11 in 2001. See a lot of immigrant, Muslim groups start rising. And then, but really we see another big explosion, 2008 during Obama's years, we really start seeing, breaking the 1,000-point, barrier. And then it dies off a little bit towards the end of Obama's era, and then Trump starts campaigning and comes back, and then we start seeing another big explosion of hate groups as well. So it's easy just to blame it on Trump, but this is something that's been happening for the last 20 years. It happens in waves into our entire history of our country. So we're going to explore this a little bit more. But a big part, I mean, we can't blame it all on Trump, but we do need to recognize, and at the same time, we need to recognize that Trump's been a huge supporter for white supremacy. And it's really, at this point, it's allowed people, it has made it socially acceptable for a lot of people to be white supremacists at this time. And like he's done everything from there was a Unite the Right rally, a white supremacist rally in 2016, a rally to try to save a Confederate monument. I think Robert E. Lee from being taken down in Charlottesville. And there's huge rally. There's counter protesters, lots, and then lots of violence, and eventually a white supremacist, drove a car through a counter protester and killed a protester and injured many. Pretty horrific situation, and so everyone's calling out. Yeah, it's like literally there's Nazis, not questioning tiki torching Nazis, that are rallying in this Unite the Right rally, and so everyone is condemning this except the President of the United States. At this time, he actually he refuses condemn this rally and actually gives or eventually gives some half-assed condemnation and then brings it out into both sides and stuff. And so it really gave the thumbs up, the green light for a white supremacist organizations to start expanding at that point. This was the beginning of Trump's administration, so you can just imagine over the last 4 years all the horrific things that happened have just emboldened these people. So really, I'd like this question. More terrorists have cited Donald Trump as an inspiration for attacks on the U.S. homeland over the past 3 years than any other person or organization on Earth. So, most of these terrorists, when they commit terrorist acts, they have manifestos and stuff. They talk about what inspiring them. More people have listed Donald Trump as their inspiration for terrorist attacks than any person in the history of this country at this moment. So not only did he gives tacit support, whether direct or indirect support to white supremacy, but also since he came aboard, he's been dismantling a lot of programs that are focused on preventing white supremacy in this country or white supremacist organizations. Department of Homeland Security has either defunds or kind of just kind of tears apart these different programs or ends them. So he defunded and stopped numerous programs in Homeland Security, but then he had this one, the Office of Community Partnership and Agencies is countering violent extremism. Used to be a really great program that would fund a lot of great organizations. Trying to remember the name of the one organization that this is one great nonprofit that works on converting white supremacist groups and converting members back into away from white supremacy and white nationalism. And it was a really successful organization, and they were a big funder of this program. They give out grants to community organizations that work on fighting hate in their communities. But then they changed it when Trump took off office. He switched it, so now funding wasn't going towards preventing preventing white supremacist recruitment. Instead, was going towards surveilling marginalized communities. Particularly, a lot of grants went to organizations that were like explicitly targeting minority groups like Muslims, Black Lives Matter activists. A lot of them went to law enforcement that helped, surveil and oppress, Black communities. A lot of them went to various different organizations that have actually been supporting hate group. So they completely switched the focus on this to, and there's, you can read a lot more. Brennan Center for Justice did a huge a report on just all the things that he's done, different various agencies and programs that he's defunded or switched priorities or whatever. And then in September 2020, there was actually a Department of Homeland Security whistleblower complaint that a high up official made a complaint that he was constantly being told for the sake of for Trump administrations is to suppress bad reports and particularly reports about the rising threat of white supremacists, but also Russian interference and things like that. So so the Department of Homeland Security, he claims, has been actively suppressing this information from the public because it would be bad. It would be bad for the Trump administration. And at the same time, Trump appoints all kinds of senior advisors, white supremacist senior advisors, from Stephen Miller, who's running, pushing all the pretty horrific, immigration policies, to Steve Bannon, to Sebastian Gorka, who literally, wears this quasi-Nazi Hungarian national, group pendant, when he gives speeches. So it's got a whole group of people that are white supremacist, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim. Sebastian Gorkin, it really pushes the anti-Muslim policies and rhetoric as much as possible. Many of these people have left or been convicted or things like that. But like Stephen Miller is still like a huge component, part of the Trump campaign right now. So then you have like white nationalists. So what is not white nationalists? And white nationalists, are basically groups that espouse white supremacist or white separatist ideologies, often focusing on alleged inferiority of white non-whites. So a lot of times it may, it's a combination of pushing this idea that white people should be on top of a racial hierarchy, but also pushing this idea that white people are being persecuted and they're losing their power, their way of life. Their white supremacy, and they have to start fighting back. And that could be a KKK, neo-Confederates, neo-Nazis, Christian extremists, all different kinds. And that's when we saw the huge Unite the Right rally was all about uniting all of these groups into this big rally where thousands of people came out. So when they did kill some protesters and caused all kinds of violence and caught on tape and not caught on tape, a lot of time, with the police kind of like monitoring and allowing this stuff to happen, so a lot of damning videos came out against white supremacists and police during this rally. So this is, so everyone's condemning, white nationalists for killing a protester, for being, having essentially a Nazi rally. And Trump's first statement about this, he did not denounce white nationalists, but explicitly instead condemning hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. So again, and he's been pushing this idea that the real terrorists are these protesters and people fighting against police brutality and white supremacy. So he was trying to avoid, anything that would oppose that narrative. So the second, statement, he got lots of crap on that. So the second statement came out. He called out KKK, neo-Nazis, and white supremacists and other hate groups. And then he gave a third statement where he talked about how there was very fine people on both sides, and criticized what he called a very, very violent alt-left, which is a made-up word, trying to claim that they're like the alt-right, and falsely stated that the counter demonstrations lacked a permit, which they did not. And then the fourth statement accused people of trying to take away our culture in reference of removing Confederate statues. So you could just see, even when he was forced to, he was cornered and forced to condemn, he immediately started basically supported right afterwards. So, that's a big one that is basically called Nazis really fine people. And then, since then, we've just seen all kinds of rallies and all kinds of white supremacist violence against these rallies as well, particularly with the George Floyd and, anti-police brutality rallies that we've been seeing all over the country. So just as of September, and these protests started I want to say like was it like May or so these have only been going on for a couple months, but since September, in the September, there's a report that over 104 times cars have ran into protesters and ran over protesters, and I think there's a few that they claim to be accidents, but the vast majority are white supremacists or people acting on white supremacist ideologies. All of them are people that are listening to Trump and the political right and being told that these are the real terrorists, the Antifada, which are just people that oppose fascism. It's not even a group; it's just an idea about opposing fascism. Black Lives Matter. People protesting police brutality. They're being sold this message that these are the real, terrorists. And this is the same message that same racial dog whistles that Reagan and Nixon did. Nixon invented this, like where he talked about. He basically coded, cracking down violently against civil rights activists as a law and order. The only time you ever see law and order come about is when right-wing organs, politicians start violently cracking down on civil rights protesters. So that everyone wants law and order. We all don't want to live in chaos, but no one says that when you have a government that's committing all kinds of breaking all kinds of laws and making all kinds of money and extortion, all this stuff. Like the Trump administration has violated so many different laws, but you never hear law and order about that. It only comes out when we need to be violent towards protesters. And so then, just recently, actually last night, I don't know when you're watching this, but as of the end of September, there was the first 2020 presidential debate. It was pretty horrific. Trump was essentially a troll the whole time. He had no interest in debating. He just wanted to troll everything, and it was pretty awful watch. I couldn't even watch all of it. Hopefully they're going to change it and maybe like just mute his mic when it's not his turn or something. But I don't know. It's so there was a particular moment where the host asked him, like, do you condemn white nationalists? He asked him, can you condemn these people? And he essentially refused to condemn them and actually gave this line, told people, he told Proud Boys to basically, stand back and stand by, which they're claiming was like his, just that was Trump telling them to that was his version of quit doing violence, but in reality, I mean, like everyone knew what I was talking about, like all the Twitter feeds and everything of Proud Boys just blew up with like basically saying, like Trump gave us permission to continue violently attacking protesters right now. I mean, it's pretty obvious. So the Proud Boys are this white supremacist organization that you're a white nationalist hate group that hold a lot of anti-immigration, anti-Muslim, misogynist positions, and they're one of the many white nationalist groups that are continually attacking Black Lives Matter protesters at this point. So I'm going to play this video just to show you what
you have repeatedly criticized the vice president for not specifically calling out Antifa and other left-wing extremist groups. But are you willing tonight to condemn white supremacists and militia groups and to say that they need to stand down and not add to the violence in a number of these cities, as we saw in Kenosha and as we've seen in Portland?
Sure,
are you prepared to specifically do it?
I would say almost everything I see is from the left wing, not from the right wing.
So what are you saying?
I'm willing to do anything. I want to see peace.
Then do it, sir.
Say it. Do it. Say it. Do you want to call them? What do you want to call them? Give me a name. Give me a
white
name.
Supremacists and
white supremacists.
White supremacists and right
Proud Boys. Stand back and stand by. But I'll tell you what. Somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left, because this is not a right-wing problem. This is a left-wing. This is a left-wing problem.
White supremacists. Antifa's an idea, not an organization.
Oh, you got it.
Not militia. That's what his FBI. His FBI director said.
Well, then you know what?
No, we're done, sir. We're moving on to the next.
We're moving. That is your administration. That's not an idea.
Everybody in your administration tells you the truth has a bad idea.
Can I tell you what?
You have no ideas.
Antifa is a dangerous,
all right,
radical
gentlemen,
group.
we're now moving on to the Trump and
you ought to be
Biden
careful with
records.
them. They'll overthrow you.
When
in
a
2
president,
seconds.
I'm going to ask a question.
So that's basically how the the whole debate. I mean, that was probably a calmer point, but I mean, he continues. I mean, he just cannot, actually outright condemn white nationalists. It's something he's incapable of doing, mainly because that's the foundation of his misinformation campaigns. Rely on these people, and the narratives that they push. It's particularly the narratives that Antifa and Black Lives Matter protesters are the real terrorists. When like Biden was suggesting, his own FBI director says Antifa is not a group. It's some idea. It's a general idea to oppose fascism. But they're trying to make mountains a villain, so they distract us from the real terrorist threats. So I'm gonna play this quick video from Southern Poverty Law Center talking about the rise of hate groups under Trump.
Donald Trump doesn't care about hate crimes. He's made that very clear. He doesn't comment on those kinds of domestic terrorism incidents. I think that the reason that we don't take the white supremacist threat as seriously is because it requires very much looking at our own culture. You know, the difference between a radical Islamic attack and a white supremacist attack is this. White supremacy is an indigenous ideology in the United States, and we don't really have, a lot of resources put at that particular problem, white supremacist domestic terrorism, in the same way we do for Islamic radicalism. It's as though we've made a choice to ignore one set of circumstances and favor another. It's been a public policy decision. The number of hate groups has been increasing pretty rapidly and frighteningly really since 2000. So in the 1990s, the number of hate groups sort of bounced around 450, a little up, a little down every year. And then in 2000, we started to see a sustained rise, which ultimately led to a doubling of groups. And what's interesting about this is that the year 2000 is the year that the Census Bureau told Americans that white people would become a minority in the future in 2042. And a lot of hate groups all of a sudden started to, begin to recruit. White supremacists commit far more acts of domestic terrorism in the United States than radical Islamists, for example. These groups have seen their numbers increase, particularly since Donald Trump started campaigning. There are other organizations that call themselves the alt-right that literally didn't exist 2 years ago. And a lot of the ferment and activity, the protests, the rallies and whatnot, are circulated around the alt-right groups right now. In particular, groups that attach themselves directly to Donald Trump's campaign have seen their ranks grow. So we've got a hate problem larger than we've ever had.
Okay, the next one is this very recently new group called the Boogaloo Boys that is this new hate group, white nationalist hate group is emerging. I'm going to play this quick video, just give a little background to them.
On a hot July 4th morning in Richmond, a few hundred people gathered near the Capitol for a gun rights rally.
I said, I got my boys here in the Hawaiian shirts, and everybody knows what that means. Hey, officers, that means boogaloo.
Many in the crowd like Mike Gunn, one of the rally organizers, are part of the Boogaloo Boys. Boogaloo is code for civil war, and that's the core goal of this loosely organized anti-government movement.
A lot of people believe differently about the Boogaloos, but the core belief is the fact that we stand for freedom, individual freedom of all, and we're willing to defend anyone's rights to those freedoms.
Would you say that the Boogaloo movement is a more extreme version of militia groups?
I think someone saying that we're extreme or saying someone else is extreme is all based on whoever's going to watch this or listen to this. They have to make their own decision. I'm not going to sit here and say we're extremists.
But the Boogaloo ideology itself takes inspiration from some pretty extreme events, like the Ruby Ridge siege in 1992 and Waco, Texas in 1993, both deadly standoffs between federal agents and anti-government extremists. The movement started earlier this year on social media, drawing in followers that ranged from hardline libertarians and online shit posters to white supremacist militiamen. Then in May, the Boogaloo jumped into the real world when armed men in Hawaiian shirts protested lockdown orders in Michigan, Texas, and North Carolina. The Black Lives Matter protests gave the Boogaloo another excuse to move from the internet to the streets.
White supremacy sucks!
White supremacy sucks!
The movement has been accused of exploiting the Black Lives Matter protests, but Dunn and his crew went out of their way to present themselves as allies. But not everyone's buying it.
This is privilege at its finest. When you can stand anywhere you want with all kinds of ammo and weapons and nobody says anything and nobody cares, that's your privilege.
The Richmond rally was mostly peaceful. However, the Boogaloos have come under increased scrutiny after a number of recent arrests. In May, 3 supporters were arrested in Las Vegas for conspiring to throw Molotov cocktails into a crowd of Black Lives Matter protesters. They were allegedly trying to spark a standoff with police. And around that same time, an Air Force staff sergeant allegedly gunned down federal courthouse security guards in Oakland, killing 1. Investigators say that they found the word Boog scrawled in blood on his van. All of the men have pleaded not guilty. These real-life examples echo the Boogaloo's violent online messaging, and the movement has resonated on TikTok, where videos with the Boogaloo hashtag have over 2 million views. And last week, Facebook kicked off the Boogaloos, scrubbing the platform of hundreds of pages and labeling them a, quote, dangerous organization. The move came months after a report by the Tech Transparency Project warned that tens of thousands of Facebook users were visiting Boogaloo pages to share bomb-making recipes and weapons expertise. Katie Paul has been tracking the Boogaloo online.
Prior to Facebook labeling this as a dangerous organization, the Boogaloo movement already had all of the hallmarks of a classic extremist movement and was violating multiple community standards in Facebook's dangerous individuals and organizations policy. Facebook labeling them as such really just seems like a cosmetic change on the company's part because these individuals were already violating policies and those policies were not being enforced. The same day that Facebook did its sweep and removed a lot of the more obvious groups that had Boogaloo-related terminology in the name, missed quite a few. And in missing those, it still allowed those individuals to create new groups. They've already created several new groups with even more innocuous names that make it more difficult for the platform to track them.
The Boogaloo Boys say that they want civil war, but they don't really have a unified plan, and it's often hard to know what's just talk versus what's threats of actual violence. But they are on the government's radar. Homeland Security has repeatedly warned that they could exploit protests, and a new DOJ task force on anti-government extremism singled out the Boogaloos as an emergent threat.
From sea to shining sea.
All right. So this is definitely a new movement that's getting a lot of traction right now, and we're going to see a lot more, I'm sure, as we move forward. So the history, so let's talk a little bit about the history of white terrorism. And we had a big section of this in the last class, or talked about with the lynching and terrorism, but I just want to do a quick little summary, and then add a little bit more about the different phases of rebirths of the Ku Klux Klan. So really, the idea of white terrorism was really around during slavery. As they often say, well, how did you control so many millions of black people from not revolting? Well, in reality, a lot of them did, or found different ways to oppose them, but a lot of the control came from terrorism. It came from, slave patrols, the early foundations that were policing, torture, things like that. So that's really this idea of controlling black people with white terrorism really got its foundation in this country. And then when slavery was over, when Civil War ended, there was a brief moment, Reconstruction era, where it was particularly radical Reconstruction, where America tried to create egalitarian society, where we try to create, an equal society for black people, newly freed black people. And that, was successful for about, a little less than a decade. And then white supremacy emerged and really fought it and overthrew it, particularly to white terrorist groups, and also some political parties. But there was some secret groups, like the Ku Klux Klan. When you see people in masks, there was a lot of secret groups. This one was started by Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, was the Klan's first leader, and he's actually immortalized in Stone Mountains. And they actually, I think it was Tennessee, just gave him his own holiday, and he was the founder the Ku Klux Klan, and then publicly open groups like White League and Red Shirts that would commit all kinds of massacres, particularly around like when there was black governments that were elected and black politicians. They would do whole massacres to kind of overthrow them. Numerous towns in North Carolina, the red shirts and slaughtered people and cold flax and all different, times. There was numerous massacres, and it was all done to eliminate black politicians and black governance and bring back white supremacy. So we see this enormous amount of violence, lynching, sexual violence, murders, pogroms, lynching, just this horrific period. Eventually, they end up. Reconstruction is only being enforced because there's a military that's down there to protect everyone. But eventually, that ends in 1877, and white supremacy completely takes over, suppresses the black vote, completely, and then white supremacy dominates the South for the next 100 years. While anytime black people fought back, the white terrorism would come back, and lynching as well. And lynching never stopped. Thousands of black people were lynched throughout this whole period. And then eventually there's the Democrats at the time, which is completely opposite of the Democrats now, were pro-white supremacy, and were actually they were basically the Confederates who were coming back to power, and they were called the Redeemers because they were selling this myth that black people, it was actually oppression to allow black people to vote and be a part of the poverty, or be politicians, part of the government, and then that was oppressive to white people, so they had to redeem themselves and redeem the South by basically through pure violence and voter suppression. But they eventually take back control in 1877, and like I said, it was the next century. The South is controlled by white supremacy. But throughout the time, so the KKK, it was originally kind of because there was actually some like anti-lynching bills during the Radical Reconstruction. Grant had passed that actually almost basically eliminated the KKK for a while. But then we saw, different other groups, terror groups were still active as well. But then they kind of phased out over, the last half of the 19th century. And then they come back, during the early 20th century, particularly around there was a lot of arguments and debates and movements around segregation, like Plessy versus Ferguson. Birth of the Nation came out in I think like 1917 or something like that, and that was like just complete. It was complete propaganda. They had all this footage of during Reconstruction of black politicians, getting drunk and raping white women and all this stuff. And the KKK came and saved the day. That really, kind of, motivated, and had a second Klan meeting that movement that caused all kinds of lynchings and murders. But then they kind of faded away after a while. There's just, and then we see a third Klan movement occur during the 50s and 60s during the Civil Rights Movement. So every time we see, this progressive, black people progressing in civil rights, we see a counter white terrorist, a white lash. And at this time, many of these Klanmen were police officers, government officials, and they, again, participate in all kinds of violence and murders and lynchings. And then they kind of faded away for a while after the civil rights movements. And then we see a fourth Klan movement that's happening again in the 1990s. And this is no longer a part of this like mainstream. They start merging with a lot of, they start splintering. And this is where, because in the earlier movements, it was mainly the Klan, but then they start, separating into all these different, organizations like Aryan Nation. It becomes a lot of neo-Nazis, a lot of anti-immigrant, adopting a lot of anti-Semitism, like cultural Marxism is anti-Semitist belief that Jewish people are controlling everything and trying to causing chaos, and we have to fight them. Islamophobia, xenophobia, all these different things. And what really was a big rallying point was Stormfront, which is this it's one of the leading white nationalist websites. In 1995, it was the leading website. I don't know if it still is, but this was like a big rally point to start bringing a lot of these, white nationalist, neo-Nazi, KKK organizations, a big organizing platform for them. But then, in the 70s, though, in the 80s, we start seeing a new, some new ideologies around these white nationalist groups, and particularly around anti-government. That video talked a little bit about, Ruby Ridge and Waco, where the government participated in these pretty awful, I don't have enough time to get into all the details, but they participate, they end up killing a lot of people, particularly in Waco, particularly because trying to confiscate their guns and things like that, and trying to, numerous flaws. I mean, it's a lot to it, but it really inspired a lot of anti-government motivation. And that coincided with a big part of like the Turner Diaries. So the Turner Diaries, it was written by William Pierce, and it was basically it's a fiction, but it's a super racist book. It's about how the violent overthrow of the U.S. government by white militants, and basically, the book is about the Jewish elite, control the government, and they use black people as their tools in the governments, and trying to confiscate everyone's guns so they can control people more, and it was a big inspiration, like particularly for like Timothy Maffei, who like did the 1995 bombing of Oakland Federal Building, which coincided with in this book there was that's what launched the revolution, was a bombing of a federal building. So the common themes from this book was fear of the United States been on total control, fear of government and black people being controlled by Jews. Fear that government would take away their guns. This is a big one that the NRA has used, particularly to sell more guns and also to get more Republicans, elected. We're going to have a whole section in another class on racist history of gun, reforms and gun controls, and particularly talk a lot about the NRA, which is a super racist organization that ends up, pushing a lot of fear towards black people and black criminals in order to sell more guns, particularly. So these are all things that you see all the time, that this fear of government taking our guns away, this fear of black people and Jews controlling everything. These are very common themes in these white nationalist groups. And another book, it was a French book, but this is Stephen Miller talks about the white supremacist advisor to Trump, talks about this was a big inspiration for him. This is it's called La Camp de Sens. It's all about how a book about immigrants of color invading and destroying Western civilization. So it's a big rally point for anti-immigrant white nationalists. In the same time, over the last 20 years, we see that there's a huge cooperation and infiltration of our law enforcement, our police officers, with these white nationalist groups. So there's no official national recruitment process or national standard for police. There's 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the U.S., and they all have their own recruitment ways, and a lot of them have deep historical connections to racist ideas going back to like the Civil War. And we're going to have a whole section on police as well in another class. But one thing that FBI did this internal report, and they found that there was this huge growing threat of white nationalists and skinheads infiltrating our police all over the country. And this started because there was a whole bunch of there was a whole bunch of neo-Nazis and white supremacists found through different instances throughout our country, and that initiated this FBI report that basically said domestic terrorism investigations focused on militia extremists, white supremacist extremists, and sovereign citizen extremists often identified active links to law enforcement officers. So they found lots of these neo-Nazis and KKK members, and Nazi graffiti and memorabilia and connections with Klansmen in police officers and police agencies all across the country. And then in 2019, Homeland Security actually did this report where they warned that right-wing extremists attempting to recruit and radicalize returning veterans from war. And a lot of these returning veterans were getting jobs as police. And there was unfortunately, the political right, instead of acting on this, turned this into political opportunity and basically said that Homeland Security and the Democrats hate veterans, created this huge, a publicity scare, and Department of Homeland Security eventually threw out a report and dismantled the whole right-wing extremist agency in their department and stopped investigating right-wing extremists entirely. So at that period, FBI is basically like the main, people trying to follow what's happening. And in 2015, FBI released this classified report that states white supremacists and other domestic extremists maintain an active presence in U.S. departments and other law enforcement agencies. And this would explain why, not completely, but why we see a lot of violence that's occurring in these protests. Police are allowing the violence towards Black Lives Matters protesters and at the same time protecting a lot of white supremacists. And we see this over and over again in an enormous amount of footage. And particularly, we see this very clearly with what's happened in Kenosha. And I'm going to play this video to give a little background.
Online videos revealing more about how 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse made his way through Kenosha last night. CBS 2's Chris Ty combed through dozens of those videos, which appear to show him armed and emboldened. Chris is live now in Kenosha. Chris.
Erica, the mayor of Kenosha, making a clear message tonight. We do not need the residents of this town's help to police it. That being said, last night, a so-called citizens brigade, including that 17-year-old from Illinois, made their way here to do just that. And before it was over, that 17-year-old's violent night, nearly from beginning to end, was captured on camera.
You are a civilian, this area is closed to them, you're trespassing, please.
While most of Kenosha was told to abide by an 8 p.m. curfew,
we appreciate you guys, we really do.
An exception seems to have been made for this so-called armed citizens brigade.
We don't have non-lethal.
So you guys are full on ready to defend the property?
Yes, we are.
Kyle Rittenhouse is 17 years old. Last night, armed with a long gun and apparent permission to administer justice. It appears from this string of online videos, he used that lethal force. First, at this service station.
Hey, keep your eyes open. Keep your eyes open.
Hey, we gotta keep him alive. Hey, bro, just talk to me, bro.
As some attend to the wounded, he leaves, and a hasty admission is caught on camera. The online video timeline shows Kyle undeterred, armed and on the move down this Kenosha street. He's eventually noticed. He's taken to the ground and appears to shoot his way back up, striking at least one other person. As police attend to that victim, Kyle walks down the block to another batch of police when yet another onlooker points him out to authorities.
Hey, he just shot them! Hey, dude right here just shot them! Dude right here just shot all of them down there!
With the long gun around his chest and his hands in the air, the boy who started the night with a thank you from the sheriff's department ends it walking right past law enforcement with nothing but a simple warning from the officer on Bullhorn. Not only did those sheriff's deputies thank the members of the Citizens Brigade, they also handed out water to them before the unrest began last night.
All right. So this is becoming a huge rally point for the political right as well. It's like defending this guy who essentially, drove from another state to come, and because because he's believing these narratives that these are that these protesters are yes, I'm sure there's property damage, I'm sure there there was violence, but this was about something fighting police brutality. This is about people that are dealing with this oppression every day, and it doesn't always come out. Their protest doesn't always come out peacefully, and these are honest reactions to police brutality that they deal with every day. So you can have an argument though about whether they have the right or not to do burn property or not. And even if you do believe that these people are criminals, that still doesn't give the right for some kid with an assault rifle to come from another state and start shooting people. Like it's a lot to this to unpack here. But at the same time, this is becoming a rally point for a lot of the political right. And I'm going to just play what Tucker Carlson had to say about this.
Are we really surprised that looting and arson accelerated to murder? How shocked are we that 17-year-olds with rifles decided they had to maintain order when no one else would? Outside the convention, chaos that began with the first George Floyd protests on Memorial Day has reached its inevitable and bloody conclusion. Last night, 3 people were shot on the streets of Kenosha, Wisconsin. 2 of them have died. Police say they've charged a 17-year-old with murder. Here's what Kenosha looked like last night. At one point, the 17-year-old, who's now been charged, tried to run from the mob. He tripped and fell in the middle of the street. A man ran up and smashed him in the head with a skateboard. The 17-year-old then fired his gun. As of tonight, we really don't have more details. We do know why it all happened, though. Kenosha has devolved into anarchy because the authorities in charge of the city abandoned it. People in charge from the governor of Wisconsin on down refused to enforce the law. They stood back and they watched Kenosha burn. So are we really surprised that looting and arson accelerated to murder? How shocked are we that 17-year-olds with rifles decided they had to maintain order when no one else would? Our leaders want us to believe that this is all a racial conflict. They're always telling us it is, but they're lying. It is not a racial conflict. At its deepest level, the chaos they have unleashed has very little to do with race. Most Americans are not bigots. Unlike CNN, they are not fixated on skin color. They don't really care, most of them. Our cities are burning because the people in charge have allowed them to burn. Tonight, the White House is sending hundreds of additional National Guardsmen and military policemen to Kenosha, and that is a very good thing. But let's be honest, the Justice Department could have stopped all of this months ago.
The violence must stop. Whether in Minneapolis, Portland, or Kenosha. President Trump and I know that the men and women that put on the uniform of law enforcement are the best of us. We will have law and order on the streets of this country for every American of every race and creed and color.
All right, so quite a few things to unpack on this, but this really shows this like narrative that they're selling, that like that violence is coming, primarily from the protesters, and yes, like I mean, majority, like upward 90% of protests against police brutality have been peaceful, but there has been some violent ones. There has been property damage, but in no way is that justifiably justifies murder. In no way does that. But they're overselling this idea where, I mean, they're literally, like, Fox News has been caught multiple times photoshopping, Antifada with like assault rifles at different events. They're trying to push this idea that these people are violent terrorists, when in reality they're protesting police brutality. The violence is coming from police. The violence is coming from these white supremacists, and they're protesting this, peacefully or violent. This is them protesting their legal right to protest, and and fight against the oppression they had to live in every day. But this has been a common, since Nixon, it's been a common, narrative is to label these people actually the violent ones, label these ones the terrorists, and make everyone else seem like the victims of them. And at the same time, sell these myths, like he was like Tucker Carlson's been called out numerous times for this bit, saying that no one was like taking control, so his kid had to go with an assault rifle. In reality, the National Guard was called out. They were were repeatedly violently suppressing protesters all throughout the night. That's just a total lie. But again, this is their narrative, is that this is the biggest threat right now, that we're under siege. Oftentimes they talk about whole cities are burning when it's only like a couple block area that's being protested and it's not burning. So it's just there's a lot to unpack. But this is just like selling this narrative that people are buying into, that the real criminals are the ones fighting for their rights not to be brutalized. And then I want to play a little bit more about how Fox News, supports white supremacists.
Fox News has spent years normalizing white supremacy, and white supremacists and neo-Nazis are celebrating. But since Trump's election, they've taken it to a whole new level. Trump has been openly and repeatedly signaling to white supremacists since the campaign, by retweeting them, by refusing to immediately disavow them, and now by defending them.
Very fine people.
And Fox News is right there to validate him at every turn. Look what happened after white supremacists committed terror attacks in Charlottesville.
This week it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson's coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next week, and is it Thomas Jefferson the week after?
How long before they show up at Mount Vernon? How long before they show up at Monticello?
We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides.
Fox claims that Trump has done everything he can to condemn these groups, so everyone should just relax about it.
If the critics out there can't accept anything ever, they're not on our side as Americans.
They tell their viewers to be more understanding of where Nazis are coming from.
There's a reason those people were out there. Some of it is outright racism and needs to be condemned. A lot of it, though, is I feel like my country is slipping away.
These conversations are tough to have. Then they praise Trump for not jumping to any conclusions.
Is he supposed to do what Barack Obama used to do and jump to a conclusion?
Perhaps the president was thinking, you know what? We don't have all the facts.
And they make the most ridiculous comparisons to argue that white supremacy isn't that big of a deal.
The same people that are demanding that the Confederate flag comes down are the same people that are insisting that the rainbow flag goes up.
And they just randomly take it upon themselves to defend white nationalists. Take Tucker Carlson, who literally promoted a social media app that's been called a haven for white nationalists.
A pro-free speech platform, so it's been popular with Milo Yiannopoulos.
No one is asking them to do this. What happens when white supremacists hear their ideas being repeated on a major news network and also coming out of the White House?
Daily Stormer, which was one of the most pro-Trump sites, in fact, they called themselves the #1 Republican website in the country for a while, called Donald Trump their glorious leader. This site also adores Tucker Carlson.
I don't even know what white nationalist means.
We talked to Heidi Beirich at the Southern Poverty Law Center, where she leads the Intelligence Project. She's an expert on these white supremacist groups and has been tracking them for years.
It builds their ranks, right? Because instead of being considered racist kooks by the majority of people, if their ideas are verified in places like Fox News or places like Breitbart, whatever the case might be, they have something to point to say, I'm not extreme.
And they rode Trump's coattails into mainstream politics.
I think that white supremacists do consider Trump to be one of them.
Hail Trump! Hail our people! Hail victory!
Now, that doesn't mean he shares every single idea that the white supremacists do, but think about the things he's done. First of all, let's look at his policies. They are rabidly anti-immigrant. These people want nothing more than to stop what they consider a Latino invasion of the United States and swamping out whites, right? The Muslim ban is something that's attractive to them. These are people who think every Muslim is a terrorist, they're horrible people, they need to be thrown out of the country. In fact, they want to throw all minorities out of the country.
And the whole time, Fox News paved the way for their rise by feeding extremism to their viewers.
Fox has been the biggest mainstreamer of extremist ideas, right? ideas, for example, of a border wall that comes right out of the white supremacist playbook. The horror of this is that people turn on their TV, they go to cable, you assume this has got to be mainstream, right? All this stuff must be middle American thinking. And what you find are radical right ideas being pushed on Fox.
One man's nativist is another man's Americanist or patriot.
Fox News will continue to elevate white supremacists for as long as Trump does. And that's why it's more important than ever for credible mainstream outlets to get these stories right.
I feel like at this point, for most news outlets, it's more important than ever to cover this movement. You have to talk about them. You have to talk about their role in politics in the U.S. You have to talk about their ideas. You have to talk about the domestic terrorism that's inspired by white supremacy. And you have to talk about hate crimes.
White supremacists and neo-Nazis are out in the open. A major news network is defending them, and our president is elevating them.
As astounding as it is to think in 2017, with this multicultural, multi-ethnic, diverse society that we live in, the fact of the matter is that white supremacy is hitting a high that it has not seen in decades.
Right. So a big narrative that the political right sells is this idea that the Islamic terrorism is the biggest threat in this country. And understandably, 9/11 was a horrific event that was organized by Islamic terrorists, and have been other Islamic terrorist attacks, and so they are a threat. Not downplaying that. But they aren't the biggest terrorist threat. We have enormous amount of data that shows that white supremacists, white terrorists are the main people committing the horrific crimes. 2017 Anti-Defamation League Center on Extremism reports that extremist-related fatalities between 2008 and 2017, 71% were committed by far-right or white supremacist movements, and 26% committed by Islamic extremists. And we have multiple reports coming out just saying that white supremacists are the major, the biggest threat when it comes to terrorism is domestic terrorism. At the same time, Muslims, anytime a Muslim carries out an attack, they receive 357 times more the press coverage, or 105 headlines to 15 headlines for non-Muslim terrorists. And not to say, they deserve, to be covered. They deserve to be condemned. We deserve to prepare ourselves against Islamic terrorists, for sure. This is a problem. But and at the same time, we have to understand that this is not as big as a problem as white supremacy. White supremacy is killing way more people and committing way more acts of terror, and we're not nearly as covering them. We're not giving them as much attention. We're not dealing with them anywhere close to what we're dealing with right now with Islamic terrorists. And then another thing that's been, occurring during the COVID pandemic is we're going to talk about this rise of anti-Asian hate crime, and this is really with this idea that so COVID originated from Wuhan, China, and and one of Trump's so Trump has, seen, as we've seen in this earlier section, Trump had plenty of time to start, preparing ourselves to, start doing lots of different things to start dealing with this COVID. We knew it was coming. Instead, Trump, politicized it, called it a Democratic hoax. Even when he knew how bad it was going to be, he was still telling people to fly and not to wear masks. So, when we look at, we just broke 200,000 deaths from COVID. So one of the ways that he kind of avoids the responsibility is he uses these racial dog whistles against Asian Americans or against Asian people. And so that's particularly why he calls COVID-19, he calls it the China virus or the China pandemic or the Kung flu. And since he started using these racial dog whistles, we've seen a huge uptick of violence against Asian American people. Read this from its report. As of July 1st, the Stop AAPI Hate Self-Reporting tool has recorded over 800 discrimination and harassment incidents against Asian Americans in California in a span of 3 months, including 81 assaults and 64 potential civil rights violations. These occurrences are likely a small fraction of what is actually transpiring, as most of these types of incidents go unreported. So we're seeing a huge uptick in violence against Asian Americans, and this is all from Trump and his his racial dog whistles. And everyone, his supporters are like, they don't, I don't know if they're being, disingenuous or they really don't understand why this is bad. They'll say, oh, it's from China. Why can't we call it Chinese virus? They don't understand that the racial these racial scapegoats are about to, even though they don't, they're made to have a racist reaction to this stuff. You say Chinese virus, you say Kung flu, that builds anger and resentments towards, well, the Chinese people are the ones that really killed 200,000, not Trump. And then that, it translates into violence against them. So there is a clear connection from this. And please don't let people try to deny that there's not. But this is a common thing that's happened throughout our history, blaming immigrants and minorities for public health crisis. We read this quote from the University of Colorado Denver report said, "This isn't the first time this issue has arose. In fact, many individuals associate particular diseases with groups of people, such as Irish Catholics are responsible for Irish disease cholera, Jewish immigrants for consumption, tuberculosis, Irish and German immigrants for yellow fever, and Italians for polio. As for Asian Americans, in 1900, when the bubonic plague began in San Francisco, public health officials quarantined Chinese residents in Chinatown, but allowed white merchants to leave the area. Now we're facing COVID-19, which originated in Wuhan, China. Since the spread of the virus to the rest of the world, especially the United States, the virus has become labeled by some as a Chinese virus." And then it comes to, so we need to talk about this idea of white supremacist free speech. And I'm not saying this because I don't want to, I understand slippery slope. I understand, the problems with censoring free speech and like, I understand the slippery slope. I understand that it's important to preserve us, but at the same time, we treat all free speech the same, and that's just not fair. We need to at least understand that there are different consequences with different people's free speech, particularly with white free speech. So if a black person comes on campus and starts, gives a speech about how all white people are evil and we should, suppress them, it's not going to go that far. Even if he motivates a couple people to do bad things, that's going to be it. When a white supremacist goes on campus and says the same thing, he's tapping into centuries of white supremacy, centuries of this, narratives that black people are criminals and we need to control them through violence. He's tapping into all these things that has consequences that often come, that does inspire shootings, does inspire violence and racist policies. It's not the same. And we have to understand, I'm not like advocating, I actually don't know what to do with this situation, but I feel like we at least need to understand there are consequences. There's different consequences for different people when it comes to when it comes to free speech. And a lot of this is, based on like our Constitution, we have the right to, free speech is amendment, but the right to safety isn't really in our Constitution. The right to, if your free speech, takes away my safety, that's still constitutional, and that has a lot to do with a lot of our, founding fathers were white supremacists. Were open white supremacists that wanted to maintain a racial hierarchy with white people on top of black people, and that so it was common. They wrote specific parts of the Constitution to continue to allow slave patrols, to continue to allow, different forms of white terrorism, because they knew it would, they knew it would help maintain the racial hierarchy. And, since the, 60s and 70s, so with 60s, we had all kinds of civil rights bills that outlawed discrimination, outlawed, racism, outlawed different kinds of racism and legal discrimination. But really it was Nixon and Reagan's Supreme Court judges that kind of countered a lot of that and got to decide, what was racist and what wasn't, or what was discriminatory, and what wasn't. And they watered down everything. They actually came up with this idea called proof of malice, where if you wanted to, prosecute someone that, around like, this idea around like, well, let me back up a little bit. So there's this concept. So hate speech is only illegal if it incites violence. If you, so if you give a speech in theory and a bunch of people, you tell a bunch of people to go out and be violent, and they go out and be violent, you're responsible for that. It's called inciting violence, and you can actually be prosecuted for that. The problem is that is hardly ever enforced, because of, like I was saying, during the 70s and 80s, a lot of Supreme Court judges they really watered down our ability to really prosecute things like that, inciting violence and discrimination and things like that. They came up with this idea that you had that proof of malice, that you have to literally say, you have to be recorded saying go out and kill someone, and then that, so you have to have this proof, and it's almost impossible to prove in courts. And it doesn't, but it doesn't factor in the, many, if Trump gives a speech, and rather that Kenosha shooter was literally in the front row, a couple months earlier was in the front row of a Trump rally where he's telling everybody that protesters, fighting police brutality are actually terrorists and they're burning our cities and we need to, fight against them. And that, could have inspired this kid to go and to another state and start shooting people in Kenosha in order to protect property. So that, but the thing is like it's impossible to prove that connection in our current system. So what we really need, we need to revisit what it constitutes inciting violence. We need to understand that, understand it through a racial lens, understand it through xenophobic narratives, and understand that, when you start, pushing racist ideas and narratives, especially when they play on people's fears, there is a direct connection to the violence that follows. For example, Trump in his 2018 election strategy was basically to build fear off of that we were being invaded by migrant caravans, orchestrated by as a Jewish plot to, like from George Soros, and so that was their main narrative. They were selling on Fox News, selling on all these platforms, and then that directly inspired the largest Jewish massacre in this country in Pittsburgh synagogue, where a shooter went in there. He specifically picked a synagogue because this was a Jewish synagogue that helped relocate refugees from south of the border. So in his eyes, they're the ones that were, destroying this country according to all these narratives he's been absorbing. And he shot a whole bunch of people. And the problem is, it's like we can't, under these like inciting violence, like Trump is, you can't prove, there wasn't enough proof of malice to say Trump actually wanted people to shoot up those things. But the fact that he created these narratives and pushed these narratives so hard that people act on violence, there needs to be some kind of consequence for that. We need to kind of revisit what inciting violence is in some way or shape, or at least at the very least, we need to understand that yes, free speech is important, but free speech has different consequences for different people, and Black, Indigenous people of color are experiencing horrific consequences for white free speech right now. So then I want to play a really quick video about a trend that we started seeing in 2018, where I'll just play this video.
Okay, here's a question for you. How many Nazis and or Holocaust deniers and or explicit white nationalists or pro-Confederacy fetishists are running for office this year? At least half a dozen, and weirdly, they're all running as Republicans, including the actual avowed Nazi Arthur Jones, running in a Chicago area congressional district, who Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas instructed voters not to vote for, even if it meant choosing the Democrat. There's also a Holocaust denier running for Congress in California as a Republican, a white supremacist running for the State House in North Carolina. In Wisconsin, Paul Nehlen, the self-described pro-white candidate, once the darling of Breitbart and Steve Bannon, is running for Paul Ryan's seat. Pro-Confederacy candidate Corey Stewart is running for U.S. Senate from Virginia. He's been openly supported by President Trump. And then there's this guy, Seth Grossman, running in a swing congressional district in New Jersey, who made plenty of bigoted remarks, but only lost his NRCC endorsement after Media Matters unearthed his enthusiastic endorsement of a 2014 white nationalist propaganda piece that said Black people, quote, are a threat to all those who cross their paths.
So I think most of them didn't actually win, but just the fact, I think it's important to understand that these white supremacists and these white nationalists, it's not coincidence that they all run a Republican Party, because even though Republicans may condemn these people, they still share the same narrative. They still share the same ideologies of anti-Black and anti-women and anti-Indigenous cultures and anti-immigrant. And then a big part of what we're seeing right now is this white supremacists, moving to online platforms and doing things like doxing and trolling and swatting. So this is something that it's really been rising with alt-right. We're going to show a video real quick on the next slide on alt-right, but a lot of this comes with trolling. If you've been on Facebook, if you made a political, progressive comment, you can all of a sudden all these random people you've never seen before are starting to comment on you and starting to gang up and making your life pretty horrible. I would really recommend, if you want to understand the art of trolling, there's actually strategies around trolling. There's this really great YouTube video called the Alt-Right Playbook that really goes into detail every strategy the Alt-Right uses, and it's actually, once you hear it, it makes a lot of sense. That's, definitely check it out. There's multiple videos of that. And then doxing, if you want to understand doxing, read this article about Gamergate. It's basically a violent internet-based practice of researching and broadcasting private or identified information about an individual or organization in order to harass and traumatize activists from organizing activity. So this is happening all over. Where anti-racist, activists and organizers, their personal information, their home, address, their phone numbers, all this stuff is being progressed, across the internet for anyone who feels like doing something violent towards them, and that has been a common strategy right now. And then swatting is another one. This is when you make a false statement, or you call 911 and make a false claim that there's like a terrorist or something horrific's happened in this house, and they send in the SWAT team. And oftentimes, just because that's the SWAT team is an overreaction oftentimes to a lot of things. But they go in shooting often sometimes, and a lot of people have been killed from the swatting practice. A really great activist and anti-racism writer, Ijoma Lu, has recently swatted, and I definitely recommend, if you want to read about her experience, check out this article from The Guardian. But on top of that, I want to just dive a little bit, like who, a lot of this stuff is happening from the alt-right. So I want to dive in a little bit about, like, the foundations and who's actually funding the alt-right right now.
These are some of the images people associate with white nationalism. But what they might not think about is the money behind it. And it's important because there's more than racist rhetoric fueling the white nationalist movement in the US. It's a question of dollars and cents. So how do white nationalist groups support themselves? This Sunday on AJ Plus, we're exploring the financial ties of the white nationalist movement in the US and the methods they use for self-promotion.
Yes, of course, we fear whites becoming minorities.
That's Richard Spencer, and he's become one of the most identifiable faces of the present-day white nationalist movement. He's the man credited with popularizing the term alt-right. The group rejects mainstream conservatism and promotes white ethno-nationalism. The real reason you know the 39-year-old is because of a man whose image is so elusive, even we had trouble finding his photo. William Regnery is a multi-millionaire who avoids the public eye. He spent most of his life spreading the ideas of white nationalism. Remember this video shot by The Atlantic?
Hail Trump! Hail our people! Hail victory!
Regnery is the man who gave Spencer his podium at the National Policy Institute. NPI is an organization Regnery co-founded and funds. He's funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into white nationalist nonprofits, journals and books, and conferences. But why? Well, he's worried that, quote, the white race may go from master of the universe to an anthropological curiosity. Regnery's millions come from his family, which earned a fortune from a textile business before World War II. Part of that money went toward financing the America First Committee. Its mission was to prevent the U.S. from entering the Second World War, and many of its leaders were anti-Semites. The Regnery fortune also set up a publishing house that today releases books by Ann Coulter and Donald Trump. William Regnery's more radical ideas are distributed through a journal called the Occidental Quarterly. Regnery is also influencing the minds of college students. For 40 years, Regnery's backed the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. The organization promotes his idea of Western civilization, which has arguably become a code word for whiteness. Its alumni even include 2 Supreme Court justices. And this is just the beginning of Regnery's influence. He's developed a whole infrastructure to fund racist messages. And Regnery isn't the only one backing white hate. Meet Robert Mercer, a major force behind the rise in popularity of so-called alt-right groups. Mercer is a 70-year-old billionaire who's invested millions into Breitbart News since 2011. The site claims 20 to 40 million unique visitors a month. Critics say it's a home for white nationalists, sexist, and racist writers who are usually shunned by mainstream media. Among them is a name you know, Steve Bannon. Bannon was an advisor to the Mercer family and served as a key member of Trump's administration. His ascent from Breitbart to the White House is a move white nationalists like Spencer have celebrated. Critics have been adamant that Bannon is in line with their views. And so, when the Unite the Right rally erupted into violence, calls for Bannon's resignation surged. Initially, President Trump offered a tepid endorsement of his chief strategist.
He's a good man. He is not a racist, I can tell you that.
Less than a week later, he was fired. But the Mercer family continues to back Bannon. So far, we've named the masterminds supporting white nationalists, either financially or politically. But their sources of funding aren't limited to rich people with deep pockets. It's the little guy's money helping to fuel this movement, too. Crowdfunding is quickly becoming a favorite fundraising method. Popular alt-right figures like Richard Spencer have used sites like Patreon to raise thousands of dollars. Patreon is like a GoFundMe for white nationalists, and not just anyone can use it. You have to be invited. Then there's Counterfund and WeSearcher, other websites where white nationalists have raised money for protest and legal defense funds. These sites began popping up when companies like PayPal, GoFundMe, and others specifically banned members of white nationalist groups from raising money on their platforms. And these groups are also utilizing internet advertising. So with all the money white nationalist groups are raising, you might be wondering why you don't hear any alarm bells. Well, Trump's administration has dropped federal funding for at least one group that counters white nationalism. Life After Hate, which helps people leave the white power movement, has seen a 20-fold increase in requests for help since Election Day. Trump decided to cut funding for the group after taking office. Ignoring the threat of white nationalists, the president has instead chosen to focus on what he describes as radical Islamic terrorism.
Something's happening, but you have the radical Islamic extremists.
So how do you combat hate when it ties back to the Oval Office and it's fueled by so much money? A lot of money has been flowing into the white nationalism movement, and we hope we've given you a little bit more insight into the people behind the scenes. Thanks for watching our video, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
All right. So that Life After Hate, that was the organization I was trying to remember, the one that was defunded. It's one of the best organizations for actually getting people out of white supremacist groups, and Trump, that was one of the first things he did was cut funding on that. And then, so I want to play this quick video. It's kind of a little tangent, but this idea about this movement about English only. It's important to kind of understand that this comes from a white nationalist background. So I'm just going to play this. I edited it down to somewhat of a shorter video. I think the total video is like 20 minutes long, but if you want to learn more about this, but I'm going to play this real quick.
We're a nation that speaks English.
It's English. You have to speak English.
This is a country where we speak English.
Wise words from President Kofifi Bigley. Since the election of Donald Trump, you've probably noticed that there has been a tsunami of videos of people going on speak English tantrums, yelling at people for speaking in Spanish, Arabic, and other languages that make people afraid that they're being talked about. But did you know that there's a national movement to make English the official language of America? I'm Matt Lieb, and today we're going to talk about how this seemingly benign movement is actually just a front for anti-immigrant, pro-eugenicist white nationalism. This episode's gonna be lit. It's called the Official English Movement, and on its surface, it's simply an unusually well-funded campaign to make English the official language of the U.S. Now, this may come as a surprise to some people, but English is not actually the official language of the United States. Nowhere in the U.S. Constitution does it establish English or anything else as a national language, and no federal statute requires people to speak it in line at IHOP. But that doesn't stop people from saying this.
Clients at your staff is speaking Spanish to customers when they should be speaking.
We speak English in America.
Learn how to speak English. Unbelievable. Live in America.
Speak English. It's America.
Ay, pinche gringos, am I right? For years, millions of English language-loving Americans have been asking one simple question. Why come English ain't not official language of America? Well, it's not for lack of trying. The modern official English movement has been going on for almost 40 years. Coincidentally, the same amount of time as the modern anti-immigrant movement. Not that they're related in any way. I mean, this isn't about race. This is about... What's this about?
Our common language, English, is that which unites us.
A common language creates a shared bond.
I think it is essential to have a central language that we expect people to learn.
A lady in my district wrote me a letter. She talked about going into a store. It was a Walmart store. Could not find the item she was looking for. Kept asking everybody. Could not find anybody that spoke English. Finally found a black lady who was stocking the shelves. Asked her. She took her to the spot. On the way, she said, I couldn't find anybody else to do this. And the black lady turned around and said, you know, I always knew something was going to bring us together. Who would have thought it'd be a language?
That did not happen. I love that this dude's idea of a heartwarming story of racial unity is a white person and a black person coming together to gang up on Latinos. The truth is that this movement to make English the official language isn't about creating unity, but rather it excludes people based on immigration status and country of origin. It doesn't take a genius to see that shrieking the phrase, speak English at people, whether it's on the street or in a bill, has racial undertones. It's not like their message is, speak English so we can be f***ing friends! That's why it shouldn't come as a shock to anyone that the politician behind all the recent federal official English bills is Congressman Steve King, the Caesar Milan of racist dog whistles. You might remember him from such hits as saying this about Mexican immigrants.
You got calves the size of cantaloupes because they're hauling 75 pounds of marijuana across the desert.
Or this about Western civilization.
You cannot rebuild your civilization with somebody else's babies. You've got to keep your birth rate up.
Or this about our former president.
We have a very, very urban senator, Barack Obama.
Ooh, he really hit a hard R on urban, didn't he? Yeah, that guy is the same guy who has introduced the English Language Unity Act every single congressional session since he took office. The bills, which have never passed, would require the government to print information in English only, require Congress to do business in English only, and make speaking English a bigger part of becoming a citizen than it already is. See, King and others claim that this will encourage immigrants to learn the language, but correct me if I'm wrong, immigrants are already uber aware that learning English in America is important. Not offering any translation services or having English-only voting ballots and IRS forms only makes life harder and ensures a de facto second-class status for new immigrant populations, which these days happen to be from Latin America. But I'm sure that's just a coincidence. Again. Of course, these official English politicians claim it's not about race, and they never miss a chance to compare the experiences of their European ancestors to the plight of immigrants today.
My grandmother came from Germany. She sent my dad to kindergarten speaking only German. When he came home from his first day in school, he said hello to his mother in German, and she turned to him and said, speaking German in this household is for you from now on verboten.
It's going to be hard to not speak a little bit of German in kindergarten. I promise you, Mutter, I will no longer speak German in childgarten. Official English advocates often talk about assimilation, but this idea that immigrants from Latin America aren't assimilating into the culture because they are not learning English is backed up by zero facts. In fact, studies show that Hispanic immigrants pick up language as quickly as in the days of Steve King's grandma, not because it's law, but because it's how you survive in this country. King puts a lot of emphasis on assimilating into the culture, and he tests that in a very interesting way.
I've given speeches at naturalization ceremonies. I like to go there. I like to welcome new Americans, but I can notice if I tell a joke, who laughs and who doesn't. Those that don't understand English don't laugh at those jokes, but they're being sworn in as American citizens.
Yeah, that's the reason your jokes are bombing. You know his jokes are probably like, okay, so a Polak, an Oriental, and a Spanish walk into a bar, because it's a jail. Wow, tough crowd. Security? What's crazy is that despite the obvious racist messaging of the official English lobby, this movement has gained a lot of ground. In fact, chances are you probably live in a state that made English its official language. 32 states have done so, including liberal Massachusetts and California. And while some people argue that these state-level bills are just symbolic, well, you know what else is a symbol? This. Okay, I know some of you right now are thinking, oh my God, just because one racist politician supports official English doesn't mean that the whole movement is racist. You leftists are all the same. You think everyone's a Nazi. Well, I just want to say this. I don't think everyone's a Nazi, all right? In fact, when our producer Kate pitched us this piece, I was like, finally, I get to host an episode of this show that's not about Nazis. But then we started researching the organizations behind official English, and well, buckle the up, damas y caballeros. This is about to get loco. The two largest organizations in the official English movement are called U.S. English and Pro English, and they were both founded by a sweet-looking old man named John Tanton. John Tanton founded U.S. English in 1983 and Pro English in 1994, but before that, he founded an organization called FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform, a group that's been behind, among other things, a push to end sanctuary cities and that 2010 Arizona bill that allowed police to arrest people on the suspicion of being undocumented, also known as the Papers, Please bill. Tanton also founded the Center for Immigration Studies, which exists solely to produce dubious studies furthering his anti-immigration agenda. He's funded or founded 12 other anti-immigrant groups, 6 of which have been designated as hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center, including FAIR and Pro English.
All right, so I just wanted to give a little bit of background on this, but definitely it's worth watching this whole video when you have a second. But yeah, it's important to understand this, like speaking is English only movement is it's often playing, it says this astroturf, you know, or this grassroots, you know, or concerned citizens, and you know, it's a well-funded anti-immigrant movement right now. All right, so I'm going to end this on some resources to kind of, and then we're going to provide more resources as well on the website. But yeah, thank you all so much for